There's a very specific posture we all tend to adopt when we interact with a 1,400-year-old ancient text.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost involuntary.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a reflex. You step into that space, and suddenly, you just expect theology. You brace yourself for the scent of incense or a certain type of magical thinking.
Right, a demand for blind reverence.
Yes. It is very much like walking into a museum. You see this ancient relic sitting there behind thick glass. It's illuminated by a spotlight, and the unspoken rule is that you're just supposed to nod, lower your voice to a whisper, and just think about how profoundly spiritual it all is.
And I mean, by putting it behind that glass, humanity effectively neutralizes it.
Totally.
It turns it from a tool into just a relic of faith. It's
Right.
completely severed from the gritty, mechanical realities of the physical world. The moment you decide an ancient text is purely for veneration.
You stop trying to actually use it.
Exactly. You stop using it to solve complex terrestrial problems, you strip away its utility, you dress it up in mysticism, and you essentially retire it from active duty in human affairs.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are going to take a hammer to that glass case. We are stepping out of the museum and walking straight into the world of sociology.
And systems engineering.
Right. Systems engineering and hard-nosed civilizational mechanics. We have managed to get our hands on a fascinating time capsule from the Tolu Islam Digital Audio Archives.
Yeah, specifically, we are looking at Lecture 3 out of 8, which was recorded in August 1979.
And the timing of that recording is just crucial context for everything we're going to discuss today.
It really is. August 1979 places us deep in the Cold War, and more importantly, firmly in the space age.
Right.
It was a period of immense, terrifying technological capability and just massive geopolitical upheaval. The speaker in this archive isn't delivering a sermon to a passive congregation.
No, not at all.
He is delivering a highly technical analysis to a generation that has literally just figured out how to leave the planet.
And the mission of this deep dive is to do something really radical with that 1979 source material. We are going to examine Surah Ar-Rum, specifically verses 25 through 27.
But we're doing it with a very specific mandate.
Yes. Here is the mandate for our conversation today. And, for you listening home or on your commute, we are stripping away absolutely all religious sentimentality.
Every last bit of it.
We are throwing out the theological dogma. We're going to dissect this ancient Arabic text exactly as two master sociologists or two systems engineers would evaluate a foundational blueprint.
Because the speaker in the 1979 archive approaches the text not as a book of magical spells, right,
Yes.
or soothing mantras.
Yeah.
He treats it as a pragmatic operating system for civilizational survival.
An operating system. I love that phrasing.
It's a manual for understanding the architecture of the universe. And the central thesis is that human societies either align with that architecture or they collapse under their own structural friction.
Wow. Okay. So to understand how a society collapses, we first have to look at how societies waste their energy.
Right.
And the lecture starts with a critique of what we conventionally call religion. And I have to say, it is blistering.
Oh, it doesn't hold back at all. The speaker draws a sharp, unforgiving line between two concepts, mazhab and Deen.
And I want to spend some time here because the psychology of this is just fascinating.
It's the entire bedrock of his worldview. He argues that what humanity has largely engaged in for centuries is mazhab.
Mazhab being...
Mazhab translates roughly to religion in the traditional ritualistic sense. It is the realm of dogmatal repetition. And to illustrate how futile mazhab is when measured against objective reality, he points to a very common, intensely physical practice.
Yeah, he talks about the traditional practices during the month of Ramadan.
Specifically focusing on the sheer physical exertion involved.
Right. He asks his audience to really look at the mechanics of what is happening. You have people fasting for 15 to 16 hours a day.
And in the summer heat, no less.
Exactly. He makes a point to emphasize that these aren't just, executives sitting in climate-controlled offices. He is talking about laborers.
People working manual, physically demanding jobs.
In the extreme blistering heat of the summer, completely cut off from hydration or calories.
The physiological toll of that is massive. I mean, the human body is being pushed to its absolute limits under the blazing sun.
But the exertion doesn't stop when the sun goes down.
No, it ramps up. After breaking their fast, the practitioners engage in extended evening prayers.
Sometimes standing for hours to complete up to 20 cycles of prayer.
And embedded within this nighttime routine is a practice called Shabina.
Okay, so When I was reading the notes on Shabina, my jaw actually dropped a little bit
It's intense.
because he describes this practice where they rapidly recite the entire Quran over the course of just a few nights.
The pace is breakneck.
But the critical, almost tragic irony, he points out, is that neither the person reciting the text at the front of the room, nor the hundreds or thousands of people standing behind them, understand a single syllable of what is being spoken.
The cognitive engagement is literally zero.
Zero.
The speaker asks a piercing question to his audience here. He says, is there any other book, any other document in the entire world that a human being would treat this way?
It's such a good point. If you pick up a manual on structural engineering written in a language you don't speak, you don't just stand there and sound out the syllables for hours on end.
Right, you'd look ridiculous.
You put it down. Or you translate it because the syllables themselves don't build bridges.
Exactly. Yet here is a text claiming to be a directional guide for human life, an actual blueprint, and the primary method of interaction is uncomprehending repetition.
I have to bring in an analogy here because my systems engineering brain was just screaming when I read that part of the transcript.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you are in charge of a massive state-of-the-art data center. You have thousands of server racks lined up.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You decide to run every single processor at absolute maximum capacity. The cooling fans are roaring, the temperature in the room is spiking, the financial cost of the electricity bill is astronomical.
You're burning incredible amounts of power.
You are putting in undeniable, massive, raw effort. But you haven't connected any of those servers to an external network.
Oh, wow.
They aren't processing any data, they aren't solving any algorithms, they aren't routing any traffic. You're doing a staggering amount of work, but the output for the real world is zero.
Taking your data center analogy a step further, if the servers aren't networked to produce a result, then all that electricity is just being converted into heat.
Just heat and noise.
It is pure friction. The speaker in the archive notes that the only thing this massive exertion of fasting and uncomprehending recitation produces is a highly subjective internal feeling.
Right. The person doing it feels something.
The practitioner endures the hunger, stands for the hours of recitation, and at the end feels a sense of, quote-unquote, mental peace. They think, I have endured this physical hardship, therefore I have earned a cosmic reward.
So the speaker's arguing that subjective mental peace is basically just a neurochemical trick we play on ourselves.
Essentially, yes.
Because if I'm listening to this, I might think, well, what's wrong with finding peace? Isn't that a good thing?
It's not that mental peace is inherently evil. It is that mental peace is entirely irrelevant to objective reality.
Irrelevant.
The speaker points out that if subjective comfort is the ultimate metric for success, then every single religion on earth is equally valid and equally useless.
Oh, that's a sharp critique.
A Hindu finds deep mental peace in a puja. A Christian finds it in a choir service. A Buddhist finds it in meditation.
Right.
Mental peace is a subjective emotional state. It is not a metric for discovering the truth of how the universe operates, and it absolutely cannot serve as the foundation for a functioning, resilient social system.
If you are running that data center, the electricity bill is only justified if the servers are modeling climate change, or optimizing global supply chains, or discovering a new pharmaceutical compound.
Exactly. Tangible results.
If the only result is that the IT manager feels spiritually fulfilled by watching the lights blink, the system is a catastrophic failure. The lecture is demanding observable, empirical results.
Which brings us to the counter-concept, Deen.
Let's talk about Deen.
If mazhab is the subjective pursuit of mental peace through ritual, Deen is an objective, measurable system of life.
Measurable being the key word there.
In Deen, the ultimate test of any action, any societal program, or any law is whether it provides tangible, lasting, pragmatic benefit to humanity.
And there's a specific Arabic term the speaker highlights for this, right?
Yes, baka. It carries the connotation of survival, endurance, and constructive permanence.
It makes me wonder, why human psychology defaults so hard to mazhab. Why do we love the disconnected data center?
It's a great question. Why do you think?
I suspect it's because mazhab is cognitively cheap. Fasting for 15 hours is physically hard, sure, but it doesn't require you to dismantle corrupt economic systems.
That is so true.
Reciting syllables doesn't require you to solve poverty or engineer better sanitation. Mazhab lets you feel like you've solved the problems of the world without actually having to touch the world. Deen forces you to get your hands dirty.
That is a profound psychological insight. Deen requires empirical verification, which means you can fail.
You can objectively fail.
The lecture emphasizes that the Quran groups the immutable physical laws of nature, what it terms afak, and the laws governing human social organization into the exact same category.
Wait, it treats physical physics and human sociology as the same thing.
Yes, it calls both of them ayat.
Ayat.
Tradition translates ayah as verses or miracles, but the 1979 speaker translates them as signs, evidence, or objective data points.
The speaker uses a very grounded agricultural example to drive this home, which I thought was really helpful.
The wheat field analogy.
Yeah. He says, look at the physical world. If you want to grow a crop, you don't stand in an empty field and recite poetry to the dirt.
That's not going to yield much.
No. You have to find the right soil, plant the right seed, and apply precise amounts of water and sunlight according to the strict, unforgiving laws of agriculture.
And when you follow those laws, the output is not a subjective feeling of accomplishment. The output is highly measurable and heavily disproportionate.
700 grains from one.
Exactly. The source notes that from a single grain of wheat, if the systemic laws are honored, you yield 700 grains. It is predictable, physical, and objective.
Right.
If the farmer gets no crop, he doesn't comfort himself by saying he earned a spiritual reward for the effort of plowing.
Because he'd starve.
He knows immediately that a law of nature was violated, the soil was too acidic, or the irrigation failed.
So the radical thesis here is that human social systems, our economics, our political structures, our justice systems, are supposed to be just as reliable and predictable as the laws of agriculture.
Precisely. If a society follows the blueprint, it thrives objectively. It advances scientifically, it eliminates poverty, it minimizes crime.
And if it ignores the blueprint, it collapses. It was a binary thermodynamic outcome.
It is not about an invisible deity sitting on a cloud grading humanity on a curve based on our good intentions. It is about structural load.
Structural load. Reframing the text this way changes the entire dynamic of human responsibility.
We are no longer passive subjects waiting for a mystical payday in the afterlife.
We are active engineers who are expected to test the validity of the text through observable socioeconomic outcomes. If a societal system does not yield human benefit, if it does not produce baqa, it is invalid.
It's mathematically broken.
Okay, but if social laws are supposed to be as predictable as farming or physics, what does the overarching framework actually look like? If we zoom out from the wheat field, how does the source define the architecture of these universal laws?
This moves us into the lecture's analysis of Surah Ar-Rum, starting with verse 25.
The text itself.
The verse opens with a statement. And of his signs is that the heaven and earth stand by his command.
Now, the traditional museum glass reading of that line imagines God physically holding up the sky, like a massive pillar preventing the roof from caving in.
Right, the word stand makes it sound stationary, static, like a building resting on a foundation.
But the 1979 speaker does a deep dive into the etymology of the Arabic word used for standing, which is qiyam or qawm, and he completely upends that static image.
The Arabic root does not describe something that is stationary. It describes something existing in a state of highly calibrated dynamic equilibrium.
Dynamic equilibrium.
The specific term he uses to explain this is tawazun.
Tawazun.
Tawazun is a state where opposing forces are so perfectly, meticulously balanced that the system maintains its structural integrity precisely because it is in constant motion.
I'm thinking about orbital mechanics here.
That's the perfect parallel.
The Earth isn't resting on a pillar. It is technically in freefall, plummeting toward the sun because of gravity.
But it's moving sideways.
Exactly. It is moving sideways at just the right velocity that it constantly misses the sun. It is suspended in this state of perpetual, terrifying tension.
Terrifying is the right word.
If that tawazun, that dynamic balance, shifts by even a fraction of a percent, the entire system falls apart. The orbit decays, and we burn up, or we fling out into deep space and freeze.
The speaker actually uses the celestial bodies as his primary example of tawazun. They are suspended through mutual gravitational pull.
But then he brings it down to Earth.
He does. To make this concept of qawm accessible, he brings in a fascinating, very tactile domestic analogy.
The syrup.
Yes. He asks the audience to think about the process of making traditional sweet syrup, which in the local language is also called qawm.
I found that analogy brilliant because it takes cosmic astrophysics and shrinks it down to a kitchen stove.
Making syrup is an exercise in exact chemistry and timing. The structural integrity of the syrup, its qawm, relies entirely on the flawless proportion of sugar to water and the precise application of heat.
If the ratio's off by a fraction, or if you leave it on the fire for a few seconds too long, The dynamic equilibrium shatters.
The sugar crystallizes into hard rock or burns into ash. The universe operates on the exact same principle of hyper-precise proportion.
Pierce the heart of an atom, you see the sun's blood.
That's a line.
That is a line of poetry the speaker quotes, and it gave me chills. It perfectly encapsulates this idea.
It's one singular, unified architectural framework. The exact same laws of mutual attraction, tension, and balance that prevent a galaxy from tearing itself apart are the identical laws preventing the subatomic particles in a drop of water from exploding.
By focusing on Taoism, the speaker completely dismantles the old deist model of the universe.
The clockmaker god.
Right. The deist model posits a clockmaker who wound up the universe, set it on a table, and walked away to let it tick down.
But Taoism requires the continuous, active, real-time operation of law.
The law does not sleep or take breaks. If the mathematical parameters of gravity or electromagnetism paused for a microsecond, the atom would fly apart and the galaxy would disintegrate.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Tell me.
Because if the universe is not a wind-up toy, and it isn't being propped up by invisible mythological pillars, but rather is maintained by active, highly calibrated laws, then those laws must have an origin point.
Right, there has to be a design phase.
And this is where the archive dives into the linguistics of creation itself, pointing out that Arabic possesses two completely distinct words for the concept of creation.
And kalk.
The linguistic precision here is critical. The speaker quotes a Western philosopher who marveled at the Arabic language for maintaining this distinction.
Because in English, we just say creation.
We use creation as a blunt instrument. We use it to describe the idea of a thing and the physical thing itself. But the text separates the process into two distinct sequential phases.
Let's pull those apart. If I'm trying to build a conceptual map of this, what exactly is the realm of Amr? Is it like the initial thought process?
Amr is the realm of pure design. It is the directive, the absolute core blueprint.
The blueprint.
Going back to our systems engineering framework, Amr is the source code before it has been compiled and installed on any hardware. It is the mathematical equation of gravity existing purely as logic before any physical mass exists to exert it.
So it's not a dictator barking orders.
No, the speaker emphasizes that while Amr is sometimes translated as command, it does not mean arbitrary orders. It means direction, guidance, the underlying operating logic of the system.
Okay, so Amr is the pure immaterial logic. It is the CAD drawing on the architect's computer screen, perfectly balanced mathematically.
Yeah.
Calc must be the physical execution of that logic.
Calc is the physical manifestation. It is the hardware. Calc occurs when that immaterial mathematical equation of gravity is finally expressed through the massive physical bulk of Jupiter pulling on its moons.
And there's an etymological point here too, right?
A vital one. The root of the word calc itself intrinsically means proportion and measure. You cannot have physical creation without strict, unyielding adherence to the proportion designed in the Amr.
If the calc is the steel and concrete being poured on the construction site, and it doesn't match the math of the AmberCAD drawing, the building collapses.
Instantly.
The physical world has to obey the logic. I remember the source quoting a modern scientist who said, "We don't write the law book of nature, we simply read it."
That quote represents a massive paradigm shift. The speaker is essentially demanding that humanity fundamentally alter its relationship with reality.
No more magical incantations in the dark.
Exactly. He is telling his audience to stop treating the Quran as a book of magical incantations to ward off evil spirits. He is saying, treat it like the book of nature. It is a text to be decoded, analyzed, and applied through the scientific method.
Our job as a species is to discover the Amr, the underlying laws of reality, so that we can engineer better calc.
Better physical and social outcomes.
Okay, hold on. I need to jump in here because there is a massive point of friction in this logic.
What's the friction?
I can see how a planet or an atom or a drop of water automatically follows this Amr blueprint. Water doesn't wake up in the morning, look at a cliff, and decide to defy gravity just to see what happens.
Right, it just flows.
A photon doesn't get bored and decide to travel at 30 miles per hour instead of the speed of light. The physical universe is locked into the blueprint.
It has no choice.
But humans aren't photons. We have consciousness. We have free will. We can choose to build the building wrong. Doesn't the human element blow up the whole equation?
It doesn't blow up the equation, but it introduces the most volatile variable imaginable. You have just identified the crux of the human dilemma, according to this lecture.
The dilemma of choice.
The physical universe is compelled to follow the law mechanically. Humans bear the terrifying burden of
The
choice.
terrifying is right.
We are the only known variable in the system that can choose to operate outside the parameters of the Emptor. We can choose to build corrupt economic systems, or pollute our environment, or oppress each other.
But there are consequences.
The lecture makes an ironclad point. Having the free will to ignore the law does not grant us immunity from the consequences of the law.
Which brings us to perhaps the most radically misunderstood part of this entire text. What actually happens when humans, who have spent centuries exercising their free will to ignore the blueprint, are finally subjected to the consequences.
This is where we hit the second half of verse 25.
And it completely reframes the stakes. The text reads, "Then when he calls you, from the earth you will emerge."
Now, what does your brain do with that?
If I read that with my museum glasses on, my brain immediately goes to the zombie apocalypse.
Of course it does.
It goes to the day of resurrection, the end of the world, graves cracking open, skeletons reforming.
The traditional theological view envisions exactly that. A singular, highly theatrical, supernatural event scheduled for some distant, unknown date in the future.
But the speaker in 1979 dismantles this myth using basic 7th century forensics.
He asks a purely sociological question. Why does the text rely on the specific imagery of emerging from the dirt?
Because the primary audience for the text were 7th century Arabs, and they buried their dead in the ground.
Exactly. The language wasn't a biological prophecy. It was a cultural metaphor tailored to their immediate, observable reality.
The speaker points out a fascinating counterfactual here.
Yes. If this text had been revealed to an ancient Hindu culture in the Indian subcontinent, a culture that cremated their dead and scattered the ashes in river currents, the phrase emerging from the earth would have been utterly meaningless.
It wouldn't have resonated at all.
It wouldn't have resonated with their cultural understanding of mortality. Therefore, the literal emergence from a dirt grave is a localized metaphor. It is not a forensic description of a future biological reanimation.
So if the zombie apocalypse reading is off the table, what is the actual objective mechanism being described? If we are looking through the lens of a systems engineer, what does return or resurrection actually mean?
The speaker reframes the return as a continuous thermodynamic pattern that is actively operating in nature right now.
Right now.
The return is the blooming of spring after the dead, frozen desolation of winter. More importantly for humanity, it is the revival of a completely collapsed society after a period of civilizational dark ages.
The text is not scheduling a date on a calendar for the universe to self-destruct.
No, it is pointing to the cyclical nature of energy, matter, and human progress. What decomposes can be recomposed.
What collapses under friction can be rebuilt, provided the structural alignment with the hammer is restored.
And here is where the 1979 historical context of this archive completely blew my mind.
This was the best part.
The speaker takes this ancient 1400-year-old phrase, "from the earth you will emerge," and applies an astonishing space-age extrapolation to it.
Because in 1979, the Apollo moon landings were recent, vivid history.
He looks at the literal Arabic translation exiting from the earth and observes that for the first time in the history of the human species, humans were literally exiting the Earth's atmosphere.
They were breaking the bounds of terrestrial gravity.
He suggests that the call mentioned in the verse isn't a magical trumpet blowing in the clouds to signal the end of days.
The call is the silent, constant invitation of natural laws waiting to be discovered and utilized.
The laws of aerodynamics, of thrust, of orbital mechanics, they existed in the Amar since the beginning of time. They were always there, calling out, waiting for humanity to develop the scientific literacy to align with them.
And when humanity finally aligned with those laws, we literally emerged from the earth and went to the moon.
Rereading the text through that lens completely alters the stakes of human existence.
It shifts the focus away from a morbid, passive obsession with the afterlife.
And demands an urgent scientific engagement with the present universe. If you believe the world is just a temporary waiting room for a magical resurrection, you don't build, you don't investigate the emperor, you just sit and wait.
You just wait to die, basically.
But if you realize the resurrection principle is a cyclical law of nature that you can harness to revive dead soil, to cure necrotic cells, to rebuild shattered cities, then your purpose becomes active and immediate.
You become a participant in the architecture.
Precisely.
And that directly sets up the friction we find in verse 26, where the text defines exactly what that active participation looks like.
Verse 26 states, "To him belongs whoever is in the heavens and earth, all are quantine to him."
We need to do a deep linguistic dive on that word, quantine or quantitune. Because usually when I see translations of this, it says obedient or submissive.
And those words carry a lot of negative authoritarian baggage.
I'll be honest, it sounds like a dictator demanding that the peasants bow down.
It does, and translating Quanatune simply as obedient is a massive reduction of the concept. The speaker traces the root of Quanatune, which comes from quenu. It absolutely does not mean grudging, fearful submission. It does not mean mechanical, unthinking obedience like a dog following a command because it fears the leash.
So what does it mean in the systems framework?
Quanatune means operating in a state of sustained, conscious alignment with the system's inherent design.
Sustained conscious alignment. Let's linger on that because it connects back to my earlier pushback about free will.
The physical universe operates in quanut automatically.
Right, the photon doesn't have an ego. It doesn't wake up and say, you know what, electromagnetism is really cramping my style today. I'm going to forge my own path.
It just aligns.
Water follows the laws of fluid dynamics flawlessly. The unique defining challenge for human beings is that we must choose this alignment voluntarily.
We have to look at the objective blueprint, recognize its superiority to our own flawed desires, and consciously constrain our egos to fit within the structural, load-bearing walls of reality.
To illustrate what this voluntary systemic alignment looks like in practice, the speaker uses an absolutely brilliant analogy that bridges the ancient world and the modern industrial era.
The water skin.
Yes. He talks about the traditional Arab water skin and compares it to a modern municipal water truck.
I want to dig deep into this analogy because in a desert environment, water isn't just a commodity. It is the absolute razor-thin line between life and death.
It is the ultimate precious resource.
Exactly. In ancient desert survival, a water skin wasn't just a bag you threw over your shoulder. It was a highly specialized, carefully maintained tool.
And the speaker explains that a vessel that is truly Quanatune is one that dispenses water exactly where it is needed in the precise micro amount required to sustain life, and then shuts off immediately.
There is zero waste.
It doesn't leak its precious cargo onto the barren sand. It doesn't withhold water when a root system is dying. But it also doesn't indiscriminately dump water onto dry rock where it will just evaporate into the atmosphere.
It is the pinnacle of systemic efficiency.
And then he updates the analogy for the 1979 audience.
The water truck.
Right. He compares the water skin to a municipal water truck equipped with a valve on the back.
The driver slowly drives the truck through the city streets.
When he passes a row of newly planted trees, he opens the valve and sprays the exact amount of water needed to reach the roots. When he drives past a stretch of empty asphalt, he closes the valve to conserve the water.
That targeted, intelligent, zero-waste application of energy and resources, that is the behavioral definition of Quanatune.
It is the complete antithesis of chaotic, ego-driven, wasteful human behavior.
And this brings us to a foundational, unforgiving concept in this systemic reading, the law of requital.
Or in the source's Urdu terminology, mukafat-e amal.
Mukafat-e amal. This is the harsh reality of the Ar-Rum. Submission to this highly productive, zero-waste order is not an optional lifestyle choice. It is the baseline operating condition of the universe.
It's like gravity. You don't have to believe in gravity, you don't have to like it, but if you step off the edge of a 10-story building, you are still going to hit the pavement.
The system doesn't care about your internal beliefs or your mental peace. It only cares about your physical alignment.
So the human question embedded in the text is not whether we will ultimately submit to the laws of nature.
We will, inevitably, either through conscious alignment or through structural destruction.
The question is whether we do so productively, like the water skin, or whether we resist the design and are forced to bear the friction cost.
Systems, whether we are talking about massive corporate supply chains, national economic policies, or entire civilizations that align voluntarily with natural law, produce more and destroy less.
And systems that resist it, that waste resources on corruption, inequality, and inefficiency, eventually break under their own structural load.
I love that term, friction cost.
If you have a company that operates purely on internal politics, where every department is fighting for budget, hoarding information, and sabotaging the others, that is ego.
It's resistance to systemic alignment.
In physical terms, it's like running an engine without oil. You are refusing to align with the thermodynamics of the machine. Now, the engine will run for a little while.
It's going to make a lot of noise.
It might even move the car forward. But the internal friction of metal, grinding on metal, is generating massive amounts of heat.
And eventually, the engine will melt itself into a useless block of slag.
That is a civilization ignoring the Amr. It might look powerful and wealthy for a decade or even a century, but the friction cost is compounding daily, and the collapse is mathematically inevitable.
Viewing history through the lens of friction cost is terrifying, but it is also deeply empowering.
How so?
It means that civilizational collapse is not a stroke of random bad luck, and it is certainly not the wrath of a moody, unpredictable deity raining down fire. Collapse is simply the mathematical sum of accumulated systemic friction.
So if the collapse of a society is a mathematical certainty when friction gets too high, what about the rebuilding phase? How does a society recover once it has melted down?
This takes us to verse 27, which I view as the intellectual climax of this entire lecture,
We're talking about the engine of reason.
and what the source views as precedent law. The verse states, "He is the one who originates creation, then repeats it, and that is easier for him."
This is where the speaker applies what we can call Parwez's rational key to unlock the underlying logic of the verse.
Yes, Ghulam Ahmed Parwez was a prominent 20th century thinker whose rationalist frameworks heavily influenced the specific interpretation.
The traditional museum glass reading of this verse is just God boasting about his magical abilities.
"I made you out of dust once. I can easily magically reconstruct your skeleton out of dust again because I am all powerful."
Right, there's that spooky supernatural resurrection imagery again, but the rational key unlocks something much more profound and verifiable.
It argues that this verse isn't dealing with theological magic at all. It is establishing a statement of precedent law, of systemic logic.
The argument goes like this: establishing the initial precedent for any process originating creation from absolute nothingness, writing the source code for the very first time, is vastly, incomprehensibly harder than merely repeating a process that already has a proven blueprint.
If we look at human scientific discovery, the logic holds up perfectly.
Think about inventing the very first airplane, conceptualizing the invisible laws of aerodynamics from scratch, building a combustion engine light enough to fly. That was a monumental historic struggle that took centuries of failed attempts.
But once the Wright brothers established the precedent, once the blueprint was proven to work within the laws of physics, building the 1,000th airplane is routine.
It is, as the verse says, easier.
The text is stating a logical axiom. What can be engineered once can be reverse engineered and repeated.
Therefore, the Quranic argument for resurrection, whether that refers to the biological revival of dead, winter-scorched soil in the spring, or the socioeconomic revival of a collapsed, impoverished society, is not a demand that you place blind faith in a future miracle.
It is an appeal to precedent.
If you have observed a dead landscape turn green and yield crops, you have already witnessed the empirical proof of the resurrection principle. You have hard evidence that the system is fully capable of cycling from death to life.
The tyranny of unproven assertions is entirely removed from the equation. The text isn't asking the reader to believe the impossible. It is asking the reader to observe the verifiable.
And to drive home exactly how this process of creation and recreation actually functions in real time, the source brings in a brilliant, very tactile analogy tied to the Arabic word yud, which means to repeat or return.
The analogy is the potter's wheel.
The potter's wheel. It's such a dynamic, almost violent image of creation. Walk us through how the speaker visualizes this process.
He tells the audience to look at how a master potter actually works. The potter doesn't just wave a magic wand and cause a flawless, perfectly symmetrical ceramic vase to instantly materialize out of thin air.
Creation is not an instant static trick.
The potter takes a raw, unformed, ugly lump of clay and slaps it onto the center of the spinning wheel.
The wheel represents the cycles of time and the continuous operation of natural law.
As the wheel spins rapidly, the potter's hands are constantly shaping the clay, but crucially, he is using a sharp tool to continuously scrape and cut away the excess material.
The source connects this to a specific divine attribute mentioned in the text, al-Bari. The speaker defines al-Bari not just as a creator, but specifically as the one who cuts away the excess, the useless, the disproportionate bits.
The evolution of the clay into a beautiful vase requires the violent, continuous removal of whatever doesn't fit the design parameters.
It is an evolutionary process of constant refinement. The universe isn't just manufactured and left alone, it is continuously being sculpted on the wheel.
And that sculpting process requires the perfect synchronization of two specific attributes, which the source identifies at the end of the text, Aziz and Hakim.
So what does this all mean for us? In traditional translations, these two words are usually rendered as mighty and wise.
But in the context of systems engineering and the brutal physics of the potter's wheel, their meanings are much more precise and technical.
Let's break those down because this is where the theory hits the pavement for human societies. What is Aziz in the context of the potter's wheel?
Aziz represents pure, unadulterated power. It is dominance, raw energy, the massive centrifugal force required to spin the heavy wheel, and the physical strength needed to force the stubborn clay into a new shape.
In cosmic terms, Aziz is the gravitational force of a black hole, or the nuclear fusion inside a star.
In human terms, it is technological capability, industrial output, or military might.
But raw power alone is incredibly dangerous.
Extremely. As the speaker notes, if a potter applies massive power to the clay without skill, he doesn't create a vase. He just smashes the clay, ruins the tawazun, and the structure collapses.
So power needs a governor. It needs a steering wheel or a braking system. And that is where Hakim comes in.
Precisely. Hakim is wisdom, reason, and flawless systemic logic. It is the CAD blueprint we discussed during the Emmer segment.
True. Sustainable creation, whether you are making a vase or building a civilization, requires absolute power, which is Aziz, guided flawlessly by systemic reason, which is Hakim.
The source explicitly argues that power without reason is madness.
We can see that all throughout human history. Think about the rapid rise and catastrophic fall of massive empires. They achieved immense Aziz, huge armies, massive wealth, incredible technological superiority over their neighbors.
But they lacked Hakim.
They lacked the systemic wisdom to create a just, balanced society. They operated on corruption, slave labor, and resource hoarding.
Their power generated so much internal friction that they eventually smashed their own clay.
Or think about modern AI development.
Yeah.
We are currently generating godlike Aziz computing power that can alter reality. If we lack the Hakim to align that AI with the objective benefit of humanity with Bakwa, we will just use that power to destroy ourselves.
The synthesis of this entire deep dive revolves around that exact tension. We started by opening a 1979 audio archive, and we intentionally stripped away the comforting layers of theology to expose the raw mechanics underneath.
And what we found is a deeply interconnected, mathematically rigorous theory of permanence and change.
The permanent principle we uncovered is that origination and return, what religion calls creation and resurrection, are actually the exact same law operating in two different phases of the cycle.
What is created can be recreated. A society that collapses under the crushing weight of its own internal friction can absolutely be revived.
But it can only be revived if its alignment with the objective, zero-waste architecture of the universe is consciously restored.
The tragedy, which represents the change part of the synthesis, is how the theological framing of these concepts over centuries has completely obscured what is actually a highly practical, urgent design principle.
By turning resurrection into a spooky campfire story about zombies emerging from graves at the end of time, human societies have abdicated their responsibility.
They have given themselves permission to ignore the collapsed systems right in front of them, waiting for a magical fix that is never going to come.
These three short verses, 25 through 27, compress a massive, staggeringly complex cosmological argument into observable, verifiable, sociological data points.
The universe, as the 1979 source passionately insists, is not a pointless play. It is not a theatrical performance put on for our subjective amusement. It has a serious, objective purpose, and its laws are ironclad.
It is a phenomenal shift in perspective. It moves the reader from being a terrified, passive observer hiding in a museum, waiting for the sky to fall, to an active, empowered engineer tasked with maintaining the delicate, dynamic balance of the world.
And if you are listening to this right now, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over on your commute or as you go about your day.
A final systems check.
Exactly. I want you to take a hard, unsentimental look at the systems you operate within every single day. Look at your workplace. Look at your local government. Look at your social circles or the supply chains you rely on.
Ask yourself, are they functioning like that ancient water skin?
Are they efficient, zero waste, distributing energy and resources exactly where they are needed and nowhere else, operating in total conscious alignment with objective reality?
Or are they running like the unnetworked data center?
Are they operating on pure friction, burning up immense amounts of energy on internal politics, ego, inefficiency, and the subjective pursuit of mental peace? Because if they are just waiting to collapse under their own accumulated structural load.
The universe has already made its choice. It stands in perfect dynamic tension.
The friction ultimately is entirely up to you.